'Twas on a Sabbath evening, in drear November days, two friends were heard creating in Perry Bar's byways. High words just fed the anger, the young man's life is fled. A shot, and then another, and Thomas Ball was dead. 'Tis sad to think of her now left, alone to fight in life, without protector's kindest care, of husband unto wife. Though fame was his, and cash not short, they proved alas in vain, and Aston Villa lose a man who always played the game. Of poor Stag's fate naught can we say, the law impels to silence. The motive too is quite obscure until they break the seal. And lonely hearts the wide world o'er will pity all concerned in this sad tragedy near Brum, of which we have just learned. Hello, and welcome to The Murder That Changed English Football, allegedly. I'm Duncan Hooper, and I'm telling the story of how Aston Villa defender Tommy Ball was gunned down outside his home in 1923. Today, you'll hear about the status of English football after the First World War, and the role Ball and his teammates played. We'll also go deeper into the trial of George Stagg, the man accused of murdering Ball, and look at how fair the legal process was. This is episode 3, By Far the Greatest Team. The poem with which I began was written by a Birmingham chess player turned travelling salesman named Frederick Gittins. It was printed onto cards which were sold to crowds at Ball's funeral, a bit like a matchday programme. The fact that the event was worth commercialising gives an idea as to how many mourners must have turned up at St John's Church in Perry Bar. Because Tommy Ball was a star, but even more so his clubmates, the Galacticos of the 1920s. When Ball joined Aston Villa in 1920, they already had 6 League Champions trophies and had finished as runners-up a further 6 times. They'd also won the FA Cup 5 times and would claim a 6th title a couple of months later. Their home, Villa Park, was perhaps the most prestigious football stadium in the world, at least until the opening of Wembley 3 years later. The Aston Villa team of the time was packed with internationals. It was captained by Andy Ducat, who played football, but also cricket for England, where he holds the distinction of being simultaneously caught and out hit wicket in a match against Australia, when an outside edge to slip broke off a splinter of his bat, which flew onto his stumps. Villa's fullback pairing at the time was another set of Tommies, Mort and Smart, who earned the nicknames Death and Glory for their consistent partnership. They racked up a total of 820 first-team appearances, also becoming regulars for England. The England goalkeeper, Sam Hardy, was another veteran who had won pre- and post-war FA Cups. Many viewed him as England's best ever number 1, although shirt numbers wouldn't make their way into the national game for several more years. Like many of the team, he'd seen active service during the war. But the real power was the club secretary, the closest thing at the time to a head coach or director of football. George Ramsey had come to Birmingham as a player in 1876 and captained the team before moving into management. He was hugely influential in the development of the modern game, but also known as a no-nonsense operator who kept a tight sense of discipline among his charges. He was the first Villa captain to lift a trophy and is credited with bringing the Scottish passing game down with him from his native Glasgow. At the time, English teams tended to play what was known as the dribbling game. Legend has it that he joined Villa after stumbling upon a training match while walking through Aston Park and being asked to make up the numbers. Ramsey always insisted that to gain selection for his team, every player needed to meet the Villa standard as a gentleman as well as a sportsman. To this day, he remains one of the most successful managers in the English game. At the time he signed Ball, Ramsey was coming to the end of 42 years in the role. But back to Ball himself. In his first few years, he'd struggled to break into the first team, but by 1923 he became a regular fixture, winning over fans and pundits. Teams back then routinely fielded a 2-3-5 formation, hence the concept of two fullbacks, which have morphed today into the left and right side of the defence. The centre half would have played in front of them and had responsibility for breaking up opposition attacks, with a left and right half beside him, one of whom would have been more attacking and one more defensively minded. Ahead of them, a left and right inner would have formed the bottom of a W formation, with two wingers and a centre forward up top. Ball had joined the club as a left fullback, apparently as a deputy to the incumbent Tommy Weston, but as I mentioned, another Tommy, Smart, was joined by a fourth, Tommy Mort, in 1922 to seal up those positions. So Ball had been used as a utility player until, as we heard in episode 1, the tempestuous Frank Barston walked out, creating a vacancy at centre half. I've mentioned the suggestion that Ball could have gone on to international football, either for England, Scotland or Ireland. But there's some debate over whether he ultimately would have made the grade. Ball's obituaries suggest he was seen as a journeyman, more solid than inspirational. Rugged and determined, wrote the Birmingham Gazette. He gained brilliance through perseverance and had the pluck to plod to reach first-class form, proclaimed the Villa News and Record. It is also perhaps significant that before Ball's death, Villa had signed aspiring Scottish international Victor Milne in his position. The sum paid, £1,500, was a huge amount if Milne had been seen purely as a reserve. Substitutes would not appear in the English game for another 40 years, and then only in case of injury, so there were no shared positions. As a side note, Milne was one of a dying breed of amateur players who still turned out alongside their professional colleagues at the top level. When not on the pitch, he could be found consulting patients as a community doctor. Whatever Ball's importance to the club as a player, his untimely death had a massive impact on a team who, in autumn 1923, were hoping to become the first to secure a league and cup double in the 20th century. That challenge would fade dramatically as they plummeted from third in the standings and then were defeated in the FA Cup final. That game will also be remembered for controversy over Newcastle United's illegal resting of key players in the run-up to the game. Although Villa did remain highly competitive in the decade following Ball's death, their glory days were definitively behind them, and they would not claim another senior competitive honour for 30 years. Ball's impact on the pitch would have been reflected by his renown off it. We've heard how his funeral had captured the media's attention, and the level of publicity would have posed a challenge in creating the circumstances for what would nowadays be considered a fair trial. The jurymen and judges who heard the case would have all gone into hearings with a knowledge of the chain of events, or at least rumours and reports. Back then, judges didn't make a point of ordering jurors to disregard anything they'd heard outside the courtroom. There were, in fact, several trials leading to Stagg's conviction, but they give the impression of a ball rolling downhill and gathering momentum, with the verdict of each seemingly heavily dependent on the result of the previous hearing. With the speed of each trial, it's not surprising that all possibilities may not have received equal weighting. But there are also questions over the role of the defence lawyers. First, 2 days after the killing, a coroner ruled that Ball had been murdered. Then a police court set out the charges before a magistrate, and the petty assizes handed the case to the more senior assizes court. This is the pivotal trial, which found Stagg guilty, but the process took less than a day on February the 14th, and that's including sentencing. There's no requirement in English law to prove a motive, and the judge recognised that the prosecution had not provided one. So we don't know why a jury would have thought that George Stagg would have deliberately set out to shoot dead his tenant. Rumours at the time and since have suggested it was a result of bad feeling over some chickens that the footballer and his wife kept at the end of his garden. As the two gardens were not separated, these could wander into Stagg's land, and Beatrice Ball testified that this had been the cause of a row. A similar story goes that Ball's high-energy terrier had been the cause of tensions which may have led to bloodshed. Other suggestions were that Mr. Ball and Mrs. Stagg were conducting an affair. Or perhaps Stagg was mentally unbalanced. The timing of the killing on Armistice Day would, for reasons we will come to, have been quite distressing for him. Intriguingly, Stagg did end up in a mental hospital, but we don't know why. A psychiatrist who examined him before the trial found him to be of completely sound mind. Ultimately, we just cannot know. The answer may never come out, unless Stagg revealed something during his time behind bars, which is being held in an archive until the UK's privacy laws allow it to be released in several decades' time. The absence of any motive certainly didn't concern the judge. Sir Sidney Arthur Taylor Rowlatt was a pillar of the British establishment. He was actually known as a tax judge and was famed for his speedy decision-making. Though tax cases are notoriously complex, Rowlatt managed to resolve 2/3 of his cases within a day, something he was undoubtedly proud of. To give an idea of his politics, he had recently completed a government report into terrorism in British India during the war, which had recommended arrest without warrant, secret trials without jury, anonymity for accusers, and restrictions on the evidence made available to defendants. He definitely wasn't seen as a soft touch, even by the standards of the 1920s. Ahead of the trial, he briefed the jurors that
the man who was accused undoubtedly did it, but under what circumstances you will have to investigate.
So it may be that they didn't start the trial with a completely open mind. But perhaps the most glaring abuse of process came during the trial, when the judge broke with protocol and stepped down from the bench to attempt to demonstrate that the shot that killed Ball could not have been fired by accident. Judge Rowlatt furiously slammed the unloaded weapon against a gatepost to show the jury that it would not discharge. He then was made to look foolish when the defence offered to take up the challenge, and by tapping the barrel succeeded in releasing the hammer. In addition to the conduct of the judge, there remain many questions about George Stagg's defence. His lawyer, Sir Reginald Coventry, had only 2 years' experience as a senior trial barrister, compared with the 3 decades of cases conducted by his opposite number. But we won't get into those questions now. We'll come back to them in the next episode. Suffices to say that the judge summed up to the jury towards the end of the day. Even without any motive, he said, the jury could return a murder verdict if a man might lose his temper against a person he did not like. From there, the case was in the hands of 12 men, selected from a group of 20, who would need to be on hand for the 2 weeks or so that the county assizes lasted. They were all men, women not being eligible, and would have also had to have sufficient means to take time away from their occupations. This would have ruled out a significant proportion of the population. Possibly they were acquainted with the judge and probably could read his feelings about a case. They might also have known how he reacted if a verdict did not go according to his wishes. Only a generation or so previously, it had been common for judges to openly direct juries towards a verdict, but reforms in the system had been designed to give more independence to the jurymen. The makeup of that jury, in February 1924, might have been quite favourable to a man like Stagg. Half of the pool of 22 were either military officers or members of the nobility. Most of the rest were also likely to be older, country men of means who might have been sympathetic towards someone seen to have been defending their property against a younger man from a different region and background. Hence, as we discussed in the last episode, the unusually long time, more than 100 minutes, they took deciding on their verdict. Nowadays, as I mentioned, that would be considered short, but back then it suggested serious questioning over the different sides of the case. As ever, there is no way of knowing what was actually discussed. All we know is the verdict and the additional recommendation they passed to Judge Rowlatt. Stagg, in keeping with his military training and the expectations of the time, kept his emotions in check when he heard the single word that would have been expected to spell the end of his life. One newspaper report described him as looking dazed, but I'm inclined to think that was probably just an effort to improve the copy, and another writer observed that he remained unmoved at the guilty verdict. Alongside their decision, the jury recommended the judge show mercy on the convicted man. As it was, Judge Rowlatt showing perhaps his lack of confidence in them, denied the request. "The court doth order you to be taken from hence to the place from whence you came," he told Stagg, "and thence to the place of execution, and that you be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body be afterward buried within the precincts of the prison in which you shall be confined after your conviction. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." Those words, despite their apparent finality, did not mark the end of Stagg's journey. It's important to take a pause here and step back to look at the context of the time and understand how society and attitudes had changed from just a few years back, when Stagg would certainly have hanged. To simplify, the sacrifices of millions of working men during the war meant they demanded better treatment in society, which was granted them through the 1918 Representation of the People Act. This gave all men over 21, rather than only those with land or property, the right to vote. It also gave the same right to some women over 30. Gender equality was still far off. Just look at the position of Mary Stagg, who did not even appear in the trial of her husband, despite being the nearest witness and even playing a direct part in events that night. But class equality did take a step closer, with urban workers playing an increasing role in society, and one which was reflected by the growth of football clubs, quite literally in the expansion that took place at Villa Park. In January 1924, the Trinity Road stand had been opened by the future King George VI, housing the first restaurant in an English football ground. It would remain one of the most recognisable pieces of football architecture in the country until its destruction in 2000. The growth in the electorate changed the political landscape at a stroke. The Liberal Party, which had represented the progressive side of British politics, was gradually replaced by the Labour Party, who vied with the Conservatives to lead the country, a situation which persists today. One area where the working class had traditionally been disadvantaged was the justice system, and there again reform was arriving. This took various forms, from recognising in 1908 that young offenders should not be incarcerated in adult prisons, to making it harder to imprison debtors, and in 1907 establishing the Court of Criminal Appeal. This was set up following concerns that judges had carried too much sway over juries, and following two high-profile miscarriages of justice. So naturally, Stagg's lawyers took advantage of this recourse to challenge Judge Rowlatt's sentence, an option which would not have been available to them 20 years previously. However, the setup of the court was not favourable to a defendant. 3 judges would hear the appeal, and all of them had professional and even personal ties to Rowlatt. The judiciary was a tight-knit circle, drawing its recruits from a relatively narrow section of society, and the attendance was still a conservative one. In 1924, the court's most senior judge, Lord Chief Justice Sir Gordon Hewitt, had never overturned an assize court decision, and he wouldn't do so until 7 years later in 1931. Alongside Hewitt was another Conservative justice, Sir Horace Avery, but also John Sankey, who would gain great fame in his later career, firstly for insisting formally on the importance that criminal cases should be settled beyond reasonable doubt, and then for drafting a Declaration of the Rights of Man, which would become the basis for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's fascinating to speculate on how much the cases he'd heard as an English judge formed his views on the importance of clear legal protections for all. Stagg's conviction was upheld by the appeal court on the grounds that the original jury's decision could not be considered unreasonable. However, the judges did agree, again, to pass the case up the chain, retaining the call for mercy. In doing so, they would have been aware that they were passing the case to a politician, and one representing a party which had entered government for the first time ever and was determined to make its mark. When Stagg's case landed in his inbox, the new Labour Home Secretary, Arthur Henderson, had been in the post for a matter of weeks, but had already commuted 2 death sentences. A former Methodist preacher, Henderson seemed determined to address the conveyor belt of executions, which had brought, on average, one convict to the gallows every single month over the past 2 decades. Stagg's timing, in this instance, appears extraordinarily lucky. Henderson's Labour had not won the 1923 election, actually gaining fewer than half the number of seats won by the ruling Conservatives. But they were able to take power through a pact with the Liberals. That held for less than a year before the Conservatives swept back in. Had Stagg's legal journey been a little shorter, or longer, he would certainly have found a less sympathetic minister at the end of it, and his chances of escaping execution would have been correspondingly lower. But as it was, Henderson took the decision. He commuted the punishment to incarceration for life. Stagg's story, therefore, does not end here. He didn't quite disappear into the prison system, although details are often murky. But we'll come back to how he saw out his last days just a few miles from Villa Park in the next episode. And we'll also explore the extraordinary story of what a war hero who had fought rebels in Sudan and been wounded by a German bullet was doing as a part-time landlord on the edge of Birmingham. So once again, my immense thanks to Colin Brown, whose work, The Armistice Day Killing, has uncovered so much about Stagg's story. And please do share and rate the podcast. It's free and it makes a big difference. Lastly, I'd like to end by talking briefly about the work of the Acorns Children's Hospices in Birmingham, Walsall and Worcester. Acorns today remains a close partner of Aston Villa. Each year, they help many hundreds of children with complex medical needs and support their families. They offer facilities which are not available elsewhere, including specialised private rooms, hydrotherapy pools, and wonderful supporting carers. They really do deliver something incredible. Every year, they need £13 million to continue their work, and they rely heavily on private donations. So please follow me in giving to this cause at acorns.org.uk.
The soundscape for this podcast was created by Sasha Sadikov for Historius Media, where stories build bridges.